ran him down. And Mr. Boyd immediately spun around at the same time, pulling two knives from each pocket, the right and the left pocket, spun around, and was able to flip both of them over. And while Officer McDaniel was standing 2 feet in front of him, and I was about 5 to 6 feet in this manner right now.
And when you say in this manner, please describe what you're doing.
This manner, with two knives in each hand, about waist high, pointed in Officer McDaniel's in my direction.
Thank you.
Now, when you demonstrated, you also explained, and that may have prevented you from showing the speed with which Mr. Boyd brandished his knives. Would you please demonstrate for the jury the speed of Mr. Boyd's brandishing?
The speed consisted of turning around and in a matter of seconds, just going back here.
Now, please take your seat, and I can ask you questions with court's permission.
Yes.
Please take your seat.
And I'm not sure if the jurors, they've been here for a little over an hour and a half. It might be a good time for a restroom
sure.
break. Is that a good time in your
Yes,
question?
yes.
Okay. Let's take a restroom break for the jury. Please stand. Just remind the witness you're still under oath and you may proceed.
I would like to show you 4 exhibits which have previously been admitted, and that's exhibits E1 through E4. First, I'd like to show exhibit E1. Do you recognize the item that's shown in exhibit E1?
It looks similar to the knife Mr. Boyd had.
Now, would you agree with me that the portion of the knife you were able to see was the blade?
Yes,
And you were able to see the 2 blades, is that correct?
correct.
I'd like to show you now what has been previously admitted as exhibit E2. Based on your recollection of the incident and your encounter with Mr. Boyd, is that the approximate blade size of the knife that Mr. Boyd used to threaten you?
Yes,
I'd like to show you what's been marked Officer Perez's exhibit E3. Do you recognize the item that's shown in exhibit E3?
yes.
And what is that?
A folding knife.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the folding knife that Mr. Boyd had in his possession when he threatened you?
I believe so, yes.
And again, you didn't see the handle so much, you saw the blade, is that right?
Yes, the 2 silver blades were in my memory.
Would you please show us exhibit E4? And that's simply another view of the knife showing that's able to show us the size of the blade. Does that seem about right to you?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Now, if I remember what you just said, you said that what you remember were the silver blades.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How firmly etched in your mind is that image?
Forever image.
Now, the state asked you why you didn't shoot Mr. Boyd, is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, at the moment Mr. Boyd presented the knife, based on your training experience, what level of threat did Mr. Boyd pose to you?
Immediate threat to me, risking my life. Yeah.
Now, why did you choose not to fire your weapon?
A lot of things went through my head at that time, and fall back on training. The training just comes back into your mind, and you want to create distance is your first option.
Now, you had said a lot of things. That's one.
Yes.
What else ran across your mind when you saw Mr. Boyd flash those blades in front of you?
actually could see my weapon firing. That just went through my mind also. I could see the impact that might have had, just with me firing my weapon.
So when Mr. Boyd flashed his knives at you and and Officer McDaniel, you saw yourself firing a weapon at Mr. Boyd.
Yes, I did. Mhm.
Why is that?
To protect Officer McDaniel's safety from being attacked and to protect my own safety.
Now, would you please explain to the jury why, even though it flashed in your mind to shoot Mr. Boyd, ultimately you chose not to?
Ultimately, I chose not to, is that I was, like I said, a lot of things go through your mind. And even image of my face on the TV went through my mind.
What do you mean by that? An image of your face on TV, what do you mean by that?
I mean, just being in the media spotlight and for that.
Okay.
Mr. Hernandez, again, many things are going through my mind right now in the course of this trial, so I may not remember exactly where I was, but I believe I had asked you a question about, this image of your face in the media flashing through your mind. Is that right?
Yes. Mhm.
How did this image of your face in the media prevent you from shooting?
Not wanting to be in that, for lack of a better word, spotlight, and trying to avoid that situations also.
Is it fair to say that you were willing to risk your own safety to avoid the negative media attention that might follow you if you had shot?
No, it's very correct to say that to prevent that. Yeah. Mhm.
Now, I know this is,
Just to prevent my family and other people having to go through that.
so you were willing to risk your own safety to prevent your family from having to undergo all the negative media attention. Is that right?
Yes.
And you chose to put your own safety second to protecting your family from undergoing all of this negative media attention.
Yes.
Now, when Mr. Boyd turned in your direction, would you please describe how he moved toward you?
Mr. Boyd, as soon as he pulled the knives and turned in my direction, he took deliberate steps, closing the distance between myself and Officer McDaniel.
So, again, it's fair to say Mr. Boyd didn't lunge at you, is that right?
Correct. Mhm.
But when you say deliberate steps, and with the court's permission, I would like Mr. Hernandez to step down and demonstrate to the jury.
You may step down.
And before you begin, I'd like to proceed with a question so that your response is in response to my question. Would you please demonstrate to the jury how Mr. Boyd drew his knives and how he moved, that is, Mr. Boyd moved afterward?
Again, I'll start with his back facing, and pulling the knives out of each pocket, very quickly, and immediately just taking deliberate steps, constant smooth steps towards myself and Officer McDaniel.
How many steps did Mr. Boyd take?
We're 4 to 5 steps.
Okay.
Just knives drawn, closing distance.
You please take your seat, and if I may approach the return course exhibit.
Yes. Thank you.
Mr. Boyd made these movements before he ever made a verbal statement to threaten you, is that right?
Correct. Mhm.
And again, the first thing that Mr. Boyd said that was threatening is, quote, "Things are going to get bad." You remember that?
Yes, I do.
And how did Mr. Boyd say it, those words?
Very aggressive tone.
And based on your training and experience, how did you interpret that statement Mr. Boyd made, "Things are going to get bad"?
I interpreted as he was going to attack myself or Officer McDaniel.
And disengagement was the choice that you made for all the factors that you explained that were going through your mind.
Correct, many. Mhm.
Now, I did not, and I guess it's my fault, I did not essentially conclude as to whether those were all the things that flashed through your mind. Were there any others that I forgot to ask about?
Like I said, many things went through my mind in a matter of milliseconds. It's the best way I can explain it. And when you're making that decision, and I probably can't even recall all of them myself.
Okay.
So, but those are the few that stick out to me.
Now, why was Mr. Boyd ordered to drop the knife? What is it about your training and experience that caused you to say that?
Why did he drop the knife?
No, why did you order Mr. Boyd to drop the knife?
To avoid the confrontation, to avoid the outcome.
Now, approximately how many times do you recall yourself ordering Mr. Boyd to drop the knife?
Dozens of times.
What was Mr. Boyd's reaction to your order for him to drop the knife?
He would respond by saying, "You're not taking my knives." Yeah, no, I'm not dropping my knives. You can't have my knives.
Now, if you remember, what was the expression that Mr. Boyd had on his face when you ordered him to drop his knives and he refused?
He had an angry expression, angry, very angry.
Now, you created distance between you and Mr. Boyd, is that right?
Yes. Mhm.
You backpedaled, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, there came a point in time at approximately 5:01 p.m. where you asked to 10-3 the air, is that right?
Yes. Mhm.
What does 10-3 the air mean?
Means to clear all radio traffic on that channel due to the fact there's a high volatile situation going on.
And did you announce that the subject is at gunpoint?
Yes.
Why do you announce that on the radio?
So the other officers who are monitoring that radio band can understand the situation that's going on and possibly provide backup if they're in the area.
At this time, Your Honor, I would like to play a portion of Exhibit C2, which is the APD radio dispatch tape, which yesterday Detective Stone laid the foundation for, and through this witness who is here to testify about what was said over the radio, along with Exhibit D2, which is a transcript of Exhibit C2.
I might just be able to ask Mr. Robles.
She said I wasn't able to.
I found that was cumulative to the dispatch, to the CADs, which was A.
Yes, sir, that's our understanding.
So with the court's permission, I'd like to play Exhibit C. The time is 7:51 to 8:20. And then Exhibit D2 is the running transcript, which begins on page 10, line 6, through page 10, line 1.
But I sustain that objection as to cumulative, to the CADs.
No, this is the radio tape.
But the information is the same. I understood that the information from the radio CADs is the same, just a different format of the information that's contained in Exhibit A, which is the CAD.
So I guess I misunderstood the ruling. I apologize, Your Honor. So the radio tape will not be played.
Correct. As cumulative to the information in the CAD.
Now, after you gained distance or created distance with Mr. Boyd, you began to trying to achieve compliance with Mr. Boyd by essentially negotiating with him. Is that right?
Yes.
You changed your tactic from giving him verbal orders to trying to find some way to calm him down and to de-escalate the situation. Is that right?
Yes.
You began asking questions in response to the statements Mr. Boyd was making.
Yes.
And at this particular point, you would agree with me that the rambling statements made by Mr. Boyd gave you some indication that he might be mentally ill.
Yes, at this time, yes.
And you attempted to reach out to Mr. Boyd and negotiate a peaceful resolution now that you were in a position where you had a margin of safety between you and Mr. Boyd.
Yes.
You began to talk to Mr. Boyd about his needs for water, food, and shelter. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you continued to create even greater distance.
Yes, I did.
Now, despite doing this, you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd never refused to drop his knives. I should say, Mr. Boyd continued to refuse his knives.
Correct.
And he continued and did in fact threaten to kill you and Officer McDaniel. Is that correct?
Yes, he did.
And how often did Mr. Boyd draw his knives? That is, put them in his pocket and take them out in that initial phase?
Numerous times.
Now, did Mr. Boyd ever suggest to you that he was going to surrender, was about to surrender, anything like that?
No, he didn't.
Now, there came a point in time when additional officers arrived.
Yes.
And at approximately 5:08, that's when Jason Carpenter, the Sergeant Jason Carpenter, and Officer Christopher Wetterlin arrived. Is that correct?
Yes.
And they were followed by other officers, field services officers, who you may have known in the past. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you saw that Officer Wetterlin showed up on scene with a beanbag shotgun.
Yes. Mhm.
And at this point, Your Honor, I would like to play Exhibit B1, which is Officer McDaniel's video, along with, which has already been admitted, and then Exhibit D3, which is the transcript of that video.
You may play.
No. Put the knife down. You got put the knife down. Pull your hand out. Stop. Not a chance to give me directions. I'm your supervisor. I'm asking you to put the knife down. You don't? Asking. You have no business asking me to put my knife down. Okay, you got it? Yeah. Okay, hey, stop. We want this to go smoothly, all right? We don't want to have any problems.
To make contact.
Okay. We'll do that. Look, here. For us to do that, we need to be able to cooperate with us, right? I do not. I'm going to tell you right now. If you get too close, you're going to get beanbagged. You are, okay?
Or an officer, you are attacking me.
Hey. Stop. One more step. He passes that rock. We're beanbagged.
Now, there came a point during this encounter where Mr. Boyd, even though there were officers who were pointing beanbag shotguns at him, that Mr. Boyd continued to close the distance between you and the other officers. Is that right?
Many times, yes.
Yeah. How was Mr. Boyd armed when he attempted to close the distance on officers who had beanbag shotguns pointed at him?
He still was armed with his knives. Mhm.
What effect did having a beanbag shotgun pointed at Mr. Boyd have on him?
A little none.
Okay. And what ultimately do you, based on your, based on your presence there and what you were able to see and learn from Mr. Boyd, ultimately caused Mr. Boyd to stop closing the distance on you and your fellow officers who were holding a beanbag shotgun on Mr. Boyd?
We gave Mr. Boyd a directive not to cross a certain location. Don't advance any further than that.
You would agree with me that in order to stop Mr. Boyd from taking a certain action, he had to be ordered essentially at gunpoint to take that action.
Yes.
And that's the only way, you would agree with me, that ultimately you could force Mr. Boyd to do something.
Yes.
He had to be ordered at gunpoint to do it.
Yes.
And this is all despite your efforts to try and de-escalate the situation and try to essentially convince Mr. Boyd that he should drop the knives and allow the officers essentially a margin of safety by no longer being armed.
Correct.
Now, there came a point in time when a CIT officer named Officer Monet arrived. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you subsequently learned, although you didn't know at the time, that he was CIT certified.
Correct.
Now, you were there when Officer Monet attempted to establish rapport with Mr. Boyd. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you said initially that Officer Monet had a dialogue with Mr. Boyd. Is that right?
Yes, he did.
Officer Monet asked Mr. Boyd if he needed water. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Officer Monet asked Mr. Boyd if he was hungry.
Yes.
And Officer Monet asked Mr. Boyd to put down his knives, and in return he would be given a hotel voucher. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Now, you would agree with me that despite these efforts to create some sort of relationship of, that we have something that might be of service or might be of need to you, that Mr. Boyd continued to essentially resist the peaceful efforts that were made to try and resolve the standoff?
Yes.
Mr. Boyd told Officer Monet this is not a negotiation.
Correct.
And then Mr. Boyd also told Officer Monet that he should try and trying to disarm him with words. Is that about right?
Yes.
Now I'd like to play another portion of Exhibit D1 along with Exhibit D3, which is the transcript. And that would be from minute 28:59 to 3 minutes and 31 seconds. And with regard to the transcript, that would be page 41, line 1, to page 43, line 1, with the court's permission.
You may.
Hey, stop. Hey, can you give me 10 seconds? Hear me out. I don't know what happened before I got here, but when I did get here, I did see they had their guns out. You also had 2 knives. So how about this? How about we all put up our weapons? You put your knife over here, we'll hold our guns with the exception of one beanbag. and we can talk. Hey, and I'll tell you this, though. This is what we will do. And it's safe for me, you, everybody here. If we're going to put those knives up and let one of us patch you down, make sure you don't have any weapons, we go from there. So that's what's going to happen. I'm just being honest with you, boss.
You don't have the legal authority or right or position not to touch me.
At this point, we do. At this point, we do, boss.
Nobody can give you permission to touch me in my property. I told you what this property is. I told you again.
Boss, don't come too close. I'm not. I mean,
You got the right to touch something.
at this point, we're conversing. At this point, we're conversing.
Hold on.
I'm trying to figure out. This is what I'm trying to figure out. Hey, you got. Hey, how are we going to resolve this, boss? How are we going to resolve this?
842 is en route with Washington.
Don't say.
How are we going to resolve this?
I don't know if we can. I think somebody's going to get hurt, killed. I don't even know.
You were there when this happened,
Yes.
and you heard an officer try to persuade Mr. Boyd to essentially give in to his request to put down his knives.
Yes.
And despite that, Mr. Boyd felt he was under attack.
Correct.
You would agree with me, and you were there to hear it, that the officer who spoke with Mr. Boyd was using calm tones.
Yes, it was.
That officer certainly wasn't using angry tones.
Correct.
And that officer was essentially trying to communicate with Mr. Boyd in a very humane fashion.
Correct.
And what was Mr. Boyd's reaction from what you could see of him?
His reaction just maintained a defensive posture and not uncooperative.
Now, there's a statement in there that has Mr. Boyd saying, "You're assaulting me." Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Now, what, if anything, were the officers doing that might be considered assaulting Mr. Boyd?
Other than giving him directives on what he should do with the knives and dropping them, that would be it.
Would you agree with this, that Mr. Boyd was perceiving things that weren't actually happening?
Possible.
You would agree with me, based on your experience at the scene and watching what was unfolding, that Mr. Boyd was describing things that he thought were happening to him that, in fact, the officers weren't doing.
Yes.
And that makes a certain amount of sense based on your training and experience working with individuals with mental illness, that Mr. Boyd thought things were happening to him that actually weren't.
Correct.
I'd like to play another portion of Exhibit B1, and also along with it Exhibit D3, the transcript. That would be on Exhibit B1, the time would be 28 minutes and 59 seconds through 30 minutes and 31 seconds. And as for the transcript, that would be page 41, line 1, page 43, line 1, to page 43, line 1. With the court's permission.
You may.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was corrected, as I often am by my able associates, that I misspoke about where I was going to play. And what I am going to play is, let me find that here. Again, it's that same exhibit, but the time that would be played is 27 minutes, 28 seconds to the end of Exhibit B1. And before I do that, I'd like to ask you some questions. In addition to being part of the officers or a member of the team of officers who tried to negotiate with Mr. Boyd, there came a point in time in which you spoke with Officer Scott Weimer-Skirch, the K-9 officer, Officer Ken Ronzone, another K-9 officer, and I believe other tactical officers who might have been on the scene?
Yes.
And do you remember telling those officers, explaining to those officers, your encounter with Mr. Boyd?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, with the court's permission, I'd like to play a portion of that video.
You may.
Well, what happened was, we got to the camp, and he wouldn't show us one of his hands. And so that's whenever I drew out, and then he gets out of the tent, and I went to try to pat him down.
Yes, the sandwich to get back down.
And I went to try to pat him down. Okay. And then he pulled out his knife on us, and we backed off and had him at gunpoint. And he threatened to kill us. And then initial call came in from the people down there when he cut through the yard, saying that he was camping out here.
Any you dog in?
Yeah, about a year almost. You guys go up to 25 in?
Yeah.
And tell them, let me see your hands, pull out the knife.
Well, he was laid in that his tent, and I couldn't see one hand, and I kept telling him, let me see your hand, let me see your hand. And so then I pulled my handgun out, and then he brings his hands out, and he starts to get up, and I told him I'm going to pat him down for your weapon, so I see a knife in his pocket right there. I was going to go for it, and as soon as he saw me trying to go to pat him down, then he pulls out his knife and then turns on us. And so then we backed off and held him at gunpoint and called for ADC.
Kind of held him in threatening manner and all that good stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Put his in service.
Yeah.
How many knives did you have, you think?
I saw two. Yeah.
Were they on him, like in a sheath?
No, I think they might have been folding knives, but they're both open in his pocket now. Because he'll pull them out and hold them like this. You know, so, I mean, the blades are about maybe 3.5, 4 inches long.
So, why did you take the time to tell other officers about the encounter that you had with Mr. Boyd in the detail that you did?
For their safety and also for Mr. Boyd's safety. Know exactly what was going on with the weapons, what type of weapons he had, where they were at the time, how he was using them.
Now, I apologize. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
That's
about
fine.
that. You would agree with me that the crime which Mr. Boyd committed against you and Officer McDaniel was the crime of aggravated assault against a peace officer?
Yes.
It was done so with a deadly weapon.
Yes.
That's a felony crime in New Mexico, correct?
Correct.
And in your view, aggravated assault against a peace officer is an inherently violent crime.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd placed you in immediate danger of being seriously injured?
Yes, he did.
And that was communicated to your fellow officers so that they can prepare for their future dealings with Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
You told them very specifically about the encounter that you had.
Yes, I did.
You described the crime that had been committed against you.
Yes.
Is that right? You described how Mr. Boyd committed that crime.
Yes.
You described the weapons Mr. Boyd was armed with.
Yes.
Even the detail that the blade of the folding knives that you saw were approximately 3 to 4 inches.
Correct.
And you armed those officers with that information so that they knew what they were dealing with. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
May I take a moment to confer you on?
Yes. Thank you. Any questions?
Good morning, officer.
Good morning.
Officer, I wanted to go back to when you first arrived on scene and encountered Mr. Thixton, Mr. Thixton never drew a weapon on you, did he?
No, he didn't.
And Mr. Thixton never refused to comply with any of your directives or commands?
Correct.
And if he had, would you agree with me that it would have been appropriate to draw a gun on him?
If he had drawn a weapon on me, correct, yes.
But Mr. Boyd, when you approached him, you in fact instructed him, was it 3 times, to show his hands?
Yes.
And he refused?
Yes.
And you also you instructed him, was it another 3 times to come out?
Yes.
And he didn't comply with that either, did he?
Correct.
And you also I also heard an instruction, did one of the officers instruct him to have a seat?
Initially, yes.
And did he do that?
No.
There was also a point where the officers requested Mr. Boyd to submit to a pat-down of his person, right?
Yes.
And he didn't follow that command either, did he?
No, he didn't.
Instead, he pulled out 2 knives at that point, right?
Yes.
And it was completely appropriate at that point in your investigation to have Mr. Boyd submit to a pat-down search for officer safety reasons?
Yes.
And when Mr. Boyd pulled out the knives, was it dozens of times that you had asked him to drop the knives, that officers had asked him?
Yes, many times.
Now, in your initial encounter with Mr. Boyd, you weren't going up there to arrest him, right?
Correct.
It wasn't until he pulled out his knives that you would agree with me, you would have had probable cause to arrest him at that point.
At that time, yes.
So, at that point, you said you created distance for your safety in that moment.
Yes.
But after the assault had occurred, officers, like you said, had probable cause to arrest him, right?
Yes.
Would you agree with me, officer, that you can't arrest a subject by creating distance?
Correct.
And at this point, after the knives were pulled and after you had created distance, you had called for backup at that time to clear the air, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that purpose in that was also so that you can have some help from other officers in apprehending Mr. Boyd and placing him into custody.
Yes.
You also discussed a little bit on direct, and I believe on cross with Mr. Robles as well, about a perimeter. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Is one of the purposes of a perimeter that day to provide for the safety of the hikers, the joggers, the civilians in the area?
Yes, it was.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask if you could turn on the overhead. And I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to show this witness what's been previously marked as Mr. Sandy's Exhibit BB5. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes.
Thank you. Officer, I'm handing you what's been previously marked as Mr. Sandy's Exhibit BB5.
Okay.
Do you recognize what that picture is?
Yes, I do.
Can you describe for the jury what that picture is of?
It's a location where we encountered Mr. Boyd
Okay.
at that time.
And does that picture, is it a fair and accurate depiction of the scene when you encountered Mr. Boyd?
Yes, it's just, it's looking west, pointed west, up towards the city.
Your Honor, at this time I'd move the admission of Mr. Sandy's Exhibit BB5.
Any objection to BB5?
No objection.
BB5 will be admitted.
Let's see. Everybody see that? I wanted to zoom, but I better not touch it. Officer Hernandez, can you show me, I guess, you described earlier with Mr. Robles a neighborhood. Is this the neighborhood that you described? Can you show me the neighborhood that you saw that day?
Yes, this area right here, I believe is, and there are these 2 houses that we responded to, I don't recall.
You believe that one of these 2 houses that you've drawn the line on is one of the houses that you responded to the call at? Mr. Thixton's house?
Yes.
Okay. And there are other houses next to that house?
Yes.
Can you also see houses across the street?
Yes.
Okay. And from this vantage point right here where the photo is being taken, do you remember, I guess, where is this vantage point from where the photo is being taken?
I think it's directly at the campsite.
So this would have been where James Boyd was camped out, right?
Yes.
Officer Hernandez, you had stated also that you did not, when James Boyd had drawn his knives on you and your fellow officer, you talked about what was in your mind, but you said that you did not shoot because you used another option of
Yes.
creating distance. That's
Yes.
what you said with the state, right?
Yes.
But shooting him was an option that you could have used based on your training and experience, isn't it?
Yes.
And that would have been reasonable,
Yes, I believe so.
based on your training and experience.
Yes.
Sustained.
Officer Hernandez, you also described James Boyd when he had stood with the knives in both of his hands as standing in a defensive posture. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Is that, you described it as a defensive posture. Is that as if Mr. Boyd was somehow squaring off to you?
An aggressive way, yes.
Okay, an aggressive way?
Yes.
Aggressive, was perceived as aggressive.
Yes.
And you've been a law enforcement officer, you said, for, it was 20 years?
Yes.
Is defensive posture, that phrase, is that often a phrase used in law enforcement to describe somebody taking an aggressive stance or a precursor, so to speak, of an offensive action?
Yes, it is.
Based on Boyd's actions that day and his statements made to you and your fellow officer, do you believe that Boyd was willing to carry through with his threat to kill you?
Yes, I do.
Excuse me, Your Honor, objection. Improper and calls for speculation. I move to strike.
Overruled.
So, just to make sure that you got the question, you believe that Boyd was willing to carry out with his threat to kill you?
Yes, I do.
And that is based on his actions and his statements that you perceived?
Yes.
Just a second, Your Honor. No further questions.
Any redirect? Yes, please.
Approach.
Yes.
Mr. Hernandez, you were asked about your approach to the campsite on this date. When you approached, was Mr. Boyd laying down?
Yes, he was.
And you talked about how you couldn't see his hands. Could you actually see one of his hands?
Yes, we could see one. Mhm.
And you were asked a lot of questions about Mr. Boyd saying, I'm not putting my knives down, I'm not putting my knives down. Did he actually say, I'm not putting my knives down because you're attacking me?
I believe so. Yes, he said that. Mhm.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the leading nature of this case. Your Honor, under Rule 607, I can lead on those issues.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Impeachment under Rule 607.
You may. Overruled.
You were also asked, Mr. Hernandez, a number of questions about Mr. Boyd's campsite. Do you remember those?
Yes. Mhm.
When you approached his campsite, you actually could see food items, water, a tarp that was put over for protection from the elements, isn't that right?
Yes. Mhm.
It was clearly a campsite to you.
Appeared to be, yes. Mhm.
You were also asked about whether you could tell Mr. Boyd was mentally ill. Is that right?
Yes. Mhm.
Do people with mental illness often have delusions of grandeur? They think they're something that they're not. Your Honor, I'm going to object. Can we approach?
Can you give me one word why you're objecting?
Well, to that question, Mark, about the issue, also, Rule 11607, I don't believe.
You can't approach and you may proceed.
Thank you. In your experience, do people with mental illness often have delusions of grandeur? Say they think they're with the Department of Defense, or they talk about being God, or those types of things?
In my experience,
Yes.
based on my experience, not usually, no.
Did you believe that Mr. Boyd was with the Department of Defense?
No,
Did you believe that he had a matter of national security?
no,
Did he begin telling you he was with the Department of Defense and it had a matter of national security within seconds of your arrival?
Objection, I think that mischaracterizes the evidence. You make that statement in seconds.
Within a short time of your arrival?
I'm overruling the objections. It was a
Within
question.
seconds of your arrival?
The witness can testify to his recollection of the events.
okay. Based on my recollection, I believe, yes, he did. Yes, he did. Mhm.
And we talked earlier, and we saw defense counsel put her knives out like this, and you did too. When you were first asked on the night of this incident about how Mr. Boyd had the knives, did you say he was pointing them in a downward position with both hands?
Yes. Mhm.
You talked about your experience as an officer and de-escalation and escalation. How, as an officer, can you de-escalate a situation?
By communicating and talking with the subject. Mhm.
How, in your experience, does that de-escalate a situation?
It slows it down, and so there's no overreacting. Mhm.
You talked about, or you were asked questions about when Mr. Boyd brandished the knives and you scooted back. In fact, once that happened, he did not walk towards you, isn't that right? He didn't follow you.
He did, to a point, yes. He did take steps, and he did stop after a while. Mhm.
And once he was told if he crossed a certain boulder, he would be fired with a beanbag shotgun, he never crossed that boulder, did he? He was asked multiple questions about that.
That's within the scope. Overruled.
Once he was told if you crossed a certain boulder, we're going to have to fire this beanbag shotgun, he never crossed that boulder, did he?
Correct.
Thank you. Moment to confirm.
Sure.
We pass the witness.
Thank you.
Or we ask the witness to be excused.
Okay. May I excuse him, or will he be subject to recall?
We're fine with excusing the witness, Your Honor.
Okay.
Just to be reminded that like all the witnesses, the rules better vote. They can't talk first.
Sure.
Everybody's excused, yes?
Okay. Thank you for your testimony today. You're excused. I'll just ask that you not discuss your testimony with anyone until the case is at a close.
Sure.
Thank you.
We have Detective Stone in the hall.
Okay.
Back on the stand.
You may bring him in.
So,
Your Honor, if you could switch it to prosecution table on the other side. Thank you.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth and nothing but the truth under penalty of law?
I do.
Thank you. May I be seated? Please state your name,
My name is Jeffrey Thomas Stone.
and you may continue with your cross-examination, Mr. Robles.
So that I'm able to make the point that I was hoping to make, I may end up asking just a couple questions from yesterday.
Sure.
So that to bring us forward to where we were. And so it's fair to say that approximately 5:02, Sergeant Carpenter and the field officers were brought, or essentially began arriving at the incident involving Mr. Boyd.
Yes, they did.
And then there came a point in time at 6:17 in which SWAT officer Jeffrey McFarland moved Sergeant Carpenter and the other officers away from Mr. Boyd to outer perimeter positions. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, you would agree with me that officers, or Sergeant Carpenter, along with Officer Monet, the CIT officer, were with Mr. Boyd attempting to communicate with him for about an hour and 10 minutes. Is that right?
Sounds about right, yes.
Now I'd like to go through what communications were made by these officers who were dealing with Mr. Boyd for that hour and 10 minutes. So during that hour and 10 minutes, you had at 5:11 p.m., Sergeant Jason Carpenter say that Mr. Boyd is 1040. Is that right?
Yes.
If you could clear that for us. Now, you know that, of course, because that's on the CAD.
Correct.
Now, what does 1040 mean?
So 1040 is the 10 code for someone who may be suffering from a mental illness or someone who has some kind of, we refer to it as a mental patient or something like that.
Now, why is it important for an officer to communicate to other officers that the person with whom the police are dealing is mentally ill?
For a couple different reasons. It lets everybody know that the person that they may be coming up to, maybe the reason they're saying 1040 is maybe because they're delusional at the time. Sometimes people with mental illness are unpredictable. Their behavior is out of the ordinary. It's not, they don't always act normal like everybody else. And because of the unpredictable behavior, officers, again, with their training, are trained to approach those people a little bit differently.
Now, you said the words unpredictable twice. Is that correct?
Yes.
And would you agree with me that for law enforcement officers, the importance of knowing that someone is mentally ill is being on guard, or that is ready for the unforeseen, what is unpredictable?
Correct.
And that individuals with mental illness, in your experience, often present behavior that's hard to predict.
Yes.
And that you have to essentially plan for unpredictable behavior to the extent that it's possible.
Correct.
And that's what makes these situations volatile. Because if you were dealing with someone who wasn't mentally ill, you could essentially rely upon folks acting rationally. Is that right?
Correct.
And that mentally ill individuals, in your experience, often exhibit behavior that's not rational.
If they're having an episode, that's correct.
Now I'd like to turn to 5:11, I should say at 5:13. And there was a request made for 4355. Do you see that? Or 43?
Yes, 43.
Now, I believe if you could show the rest, the statement below it. Let me just get that. Do you see that? It says 4355?
Yes.
And that was requested by Sergeant Carpenter.
That's correct.
And what does it mean, 4355? What is that?
Well, 43 and 55 are the 10 codes for requesting Albuquerque ambulance and for fire, AFD.
Why did Sergeant Carpenter at this point, about 513, request fire and ambulance when there was no one who had been injured at this point?
Because of the rapidly evolving situation, in the event that a use of force was going to have to be made in order to take James Boyd into custody, he wanted to have rescue personnel there on scene. So if that did arise to that level of any kind of force, then rescue would be right there to attend. Or if, say, if Mr. Boyd actually stabbed or hurt an officer, then they would have rescue right there for that officer or for James Boyd.
Based on your investigation, how far away from the location where Mr. Boyd was, where the standoff with Mr. Boyd was happening, was the fire and, I should say, the fire department's rescue unit and the ambulance located?
They were located at the top of Copper, at that parking lot where the open space officers had originally parked, so that's probably approximately a quarter mile.
Okay. So during this entire incident, beginning at approximately, I believe, 5:15 or so, there was an Albuquerque ambulance and an Albuquerque Fire Department rescue vehicle staged approximately a quarter mile away from where the standoff was taking place.
Yes.
Now, turning your attention to what happened at 5:14. Now, it's correct to say that at 5:14, Sergeant Carpenter is communicating over the radio and stating that CIT is on scene, making contact with the male subject, and that male subject is not listening to commands. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, it is.
Why do law enforcement officers communicate the status of negotiations with a person, a mentally ill person, over the radio?
Again, they want to make a record of it on the CAD about how the situation is going, how it's unfolding, for any subsequent investigation later. It also is letting any other still responding officers come into the scene that there is a CIT officer going direct with Mr. Boyd. But however, the male is not listening to commands, but they're still talking to him. So they just want to let everyone who may not be right there being able to listen to this still en route know the status of what's going on.
Again, CIT is a crisis intervention trained officer, is that right?
That's correct.
And at this particular scene, there were two CIT officers and one CIT sergeant, is that right?
I don't know if Sergeant Carpenter was CIT or not.
Okay. Well, let's just talk about the officers then. Officer Monet was a CIT officer who responded to this call.
Correct.
And he served in that capacity during this incident.
Yes, he did.
Brock Nipbrath, another Albuquerque Police Department officer, is also CIT trained.
Correct.
And he served as a cover officer, is that right?
That's correct.
He was armed with a rifle.
That's correct.
And you would agree with me that despite the fact that you have several, or you might have, or in this case you have two CIT officers, only one CIT officer is doing that work at a time.
Correct. Based on the CIT training, you don't want to have multiple forms of communication with somebody, which means you don't want to have two or three people talking to one person because it could agitate them, frustrate them, confuse them. So that's why only one person does the dialogue to kind of keep them focused.
Okay, let's move to 5:22. And at 5:22, there is a statement made by S55, and again, S55 is Sergeant Carpenter.
Correct.
And what does that say?
It says it's requesting an on-call gang detective with a taser beanbag. And he said taser beanbag over the radio. He was referring to the taser shotgun.
Okay. Now, you had an opportunity to review what's on the CAD with what the radio tape actually said. Is that right?
Yes.
What was actually requested by Sergeant Carpenter on the radio?
He got on the radio and asked dispatch to call a gang detective and see what their ETA would be if they had it with a taser shotgun.
Was that Sergeant Carpenter's initial request?
From what I can recall, yes.
So Sergeant Carpenter had requested a taser shotgun. Is that right?
Yes.
And that there came a point in time when a request was made over by the radio operator or radio control, is that right?
That's correct. The supervisor up at communications.
And the supervisor, upon Sergeant Carpenter's request, called Detective Sandy.
Yes.
Now, turning your attention to 5:23. Would you please explain who made this comment and what was said about Mr. Boyd?
Again, Sam 55, who was Sergeant Carpenter, made this comment over the radio that the subject is armed with 2 knives. I did pull them out and walk towards the 34s. That is the 10 code for officers. He's not being reasonable. Male was advised not to pass a certain point or he would be beanbagged.
Why is it important for a sergeant to communicate this information over the air?
Again, because it's another step in the direction of this becoming a more volatile situation. So one, he wants to make a record of it, so it's on the CAD for later investigation. But for the more immediacy, he's letting still more officers know that are en route that he's still armed, at least at this point, and is not cooperating with officers, and now it's risen to the level where they've had to actually tell him that, you know, if you come any closer or past a certain point, we're going to use force.
Now, as an investigator reviewing this, you would agree with me that the radio dispatch, the actual radio dispatch made by Sergeant Carpenter, is consistent with and supports the CAD history, is that right?
Yes.
And based, as an investigator, what crime is being described in this communication?
Based on my investigation, aggravated assault on those officers.
So it'd be fair to say that when officers read this comment, that they are being told that Mr. Boyd had committed the crime of aggravated assault against a peace officer?
It would be an indicator for that, yes.
Now, turning your attention to what happened at 524. Would you please explain who made this comment and what this comment means?
Yes, so again, Sergeant Carpenter is the one making this radio transmission, and he's saying, check the estimated time of arrival for CNT. So again, the crisis negotiation team is different than the CIT trained officers. They're actually an on-call group of either officers, detectives, sergeants, and lieutenant that will actually respond in a big, huge van, and they will go to these types of call-outs, and they will take over eventually the negotiations, if there is a negotiation that needs to be done. Now, in my experience, the CNT is usually only ever called out when there's an actual SWAT call-out.
So it's fair to say that Sergeant Carpenter was making an assessment about how his CIT officer, or how his CIT officer Monet was doing, and made a request for the call out of the CNT team. Is that right?
Check his speculation as to the first part of the question.
I'm going to sustain it.
Based on your investigation, is it correct to say that Sergeant Carpenter was seeking out the assistance of the crisis negotiations team because the CIT officer who was involved in the negotiation wasn't having the desired effect?
Same objection.
I'm going to overrule it.
I believe that he was making this request more because it was going to go the route of treating Mr. Boyd as an armed, barricaded subject, which means he would have needed more resources than just what they had on scene. Not so much that he felt McCall Monet was doing a bad job or anything like that.
Now, in this particular transmission, there's also requesting liaison with the state police. What does that mean?
Based on what was going on at the scene, the fact that James Boyd continued to talk about wanting to talk with state police, Sergeant Carpenter was seeking out that avenue to see if that would be the thing that would resolve this situation. So that's why he made the request to see if there was any state police patrolman that could come to their scene, preferably who is CIT trained.
Now, would you please explain how the what the communication process is when an Albuquerque Police Department officer asks for a state police officer and all the sort of steps that need to happen for that to occur?
Sure. Because we don't actually have radio communication with state police, our radios are different than theirs. Whenever we need to communicate with state police as far as being in the field, a request has to go through dispatch, and then dispatch will call state police's dispatch, and that is how a state police officer, if there's one available, would come to the location.
Okay. And you would agree that based on your investigation, all of those steps were taken by the Albuquerque Police Department to essentially have a state police officer dispatched to the incident involving Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
Now, turning your attention to what's happening at 526. Would you please explain this comment?
Yes, so at 5:26, again, you're going to see Sergeant Carpenter got on the radio and requested that K-9 come out to the scene.
Okay, and when it says K-9 come out to the scene, what exactly does that mean?
He is requesting K-9 officers to respond to the scene to assist them because of the nature of the call and the ongoing situation with James Boyd.
Based on your investigation, which K-9 officers responded to this request made by Sergeant Carpenter for K-9?
Officers Scott Weimer-Skirch and Kenneth Ronzone.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to what was happening at 5:59 in the afternoon. Would you please identify who made this comment and what this comment means?
Yes, this comment again was made by Sam 55, who is Sergeant Jason Carpenter. At this point in time, State Police Officer Mitch Bankston had arrived on scene and was actually speaking with James Boyd. But he's saying that still no progress is made as far as Boyd surrendering.
So when it says State Police went 56,
56 means that they arrived. That's the 10 code term for arrived.
And 25ing? What is that?
Contacting.
And that despite the fact that Mr. Boyd had made a request for state police to appear at the scene, and despite the fact that state police officers appeared at the scene, those state police officers were not able to negotiate with Mr. Boyd. Is that right?
Not for him to surrender, no.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention to what happened at 6 o'clock. Who made this comment, and what does this comment mean?
Again, the comment was made by Sergeant Jason Carpenter, Sam 55. The comment, male was asked to put weapons down on the ground and walk to 34s, walk to officers. And he said over the radio, exact statements were, he won't submit to anybody.
So when you use two pronouns, he, and I'd like to be sure that everyone's clear. Sergeant Carpenter is saying that Mr. Boyd made the statement, quote, he won't submit to anybody.
That's correct.
Now, there came a point in time when, during your investigation, when you had an opportunity to review the negotiations that were actually conducted by CIT Officer Monet, is that right?
Yes.
And you had an opportunity to review not just just one videotape made of the negotiation, but of all the officers' videotapes made of the negotiation.
Yes.
And in fact, you created in your police report a very detailed summary of all the statements that were made by Mr. Boyd and all of the things that were asked of him. Is that right?
Yes. It wasn't obviously every single word, but I tried my best to put in all the pertinent information in there.
And you would agree with me that taking all of the videos that were taken of this particular encounter with Mr. Boyd, you were able to capture more information than just simply relying upon one video for all your information.
Yes.
There were some officers who had their videos closer to Mr. Boyd than others. Is that right?
Correct.
And there were other officers who were speaking who may not have been heard by that video, but would have been you've been able to hear them on their own video.
Yes.
And you took all of that information and analyzed it and came to some conclusions about how this negotiation went. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that when the officers attempted to communicate with Mr. Boyd, they were trying to reassure him and let him know they were there to help him?
Yes, that was communicated to him.
And you would agree with me that the officers made a number of attempts to find out what was bothering Mr. Boyd, what was causing his upset?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that in the course of that, the officers allowed Mr. Boyd to ventilate his feelings, that is, express his anger, express his fears, express whatever it is that he was feeling at the time.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that in your review of all of these videotapes, there were no officers who threatened Mr. Boyd, is that right?
No.
Okay. You would agree with me that the officers tried to avoid topics that might agitate Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
Okay. You would agree with me that these officers tried to guide the conversation with Mr. Boyd to topics that might ease the situation?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that the CIT officers and those who negotiated with Mr. Boyd initially were very truthful with him?
Yes.
Sometimes the officers had to tell them the truth, that Mr. Boyd needed to put down his knives.
That's correct.
And those officers tried to negotiate with Mr. Boyd a way that Mr. Boyd could release control of his knives that would be agreeable to him.
They tried, yes.
And you would agree with me that despite those efforts of those officers, they failed to convince Mr. Boyd to relinquish control of his knives.
That's correct. He never put them on the ground.
You would agree with me that when Mr. Boyd was essentially, you recall that when Sergeant Carpenter asked Mr. Boyd what was necessary or what was going to resolve this situation, Mr. Boyd said, "I don't think we can. I think somebody's going to get hurt, killed. I don't even know." Do you remember Mr. Boyd saying that in the response to Sergeant Carpenter's question?
Yeah, it sounds about right, yes.
And you would agree with me that despite the fact that these officers were doing their very best to try and find a peaceful way to end the standoff, Mr. Boyd continued to threaten them with death and great serious bodily harm?
That's true. And I also think it's important to point out that the intent was to take Mr. Boyd into custody. However, I know that through their conversation, that particular part wasn't really relayed to him as far as going to jail. They did avoid that.
So one of the things that's always a problem when dealing with someone who's mentally ill, who's committed a crime, is that taking them to jail, unfortunately, is the way that these things end up being resolved.
If they commit a crime, then yes, just because they have a mental illness does not mean that they still won't be charged with the crime if they've committed one.
And it is a very difficult thing to try and explain to someone who's mentally ill and suspicious or fearful of the police that, because of what they did, they will end up being taken to jail.
Not just with the mentally ill, it's actually very difficult to explain to almost anybody that they're going to jail.
And the resistance is natural.
Yes.
And that sometimes they're fearful.
Yes.
And that people who aren't mentally ill are fearful of going to jail.
Yes, very much so.
So you were asked a series of questions about fear statements and threatening statements.
Yes.
Now, in your review of the audio tapes and the videotapes that were taken, you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd made statements where he indicated that he was fearful.
That's correct.
But you would also agree with me that Mr. Boyd expressed fear when the officers weren't actually doing anything to threaten his safety.
That's correct.
So Mr. Boyd would say, "I'm under assault," when in fact the officers were doing nothing of the sort.
It's hard to say why he thought that at that particular moment when he said it, the officers were assaulting him. But that was during the course of just the dialogue when there was separation between the officers and him.
So you would agree with me that despite the fact that Mr. Boyd made these so-called fear statements, that many of them simply weren't supported by what the officers were doing to him?
No, I believe it was just the mere presence of the officers there is what was making him fearful.
And you would agree with me in your experience as a law enforcement officer that when someone has committed a crime, that fear is often a factor in the way in which a suspect reacts to you?
It can be, yes.
Yeah. And that it's not just simply the mentally ill that are fearful of the police taking them to jail. It's also people who aren't mentally ill.
That's correct.
So the expression of fear in and of itself is not something that's unusual when someone, knows that they will end up going to jail.
That's correct.
Now I'd like to talk to you about what happened at 6:04. Now, who made this request and what is this request?
So Sergeant Carpenter, Sam 55, made the request, and he's requesting the Real-Time Crime Center unit. And to explain what that is it's an area kind of like dispatch where it's made up of officers who sit down at a table and they have multiple computer screens in front of them. And they have quick access to our police databases in order to run people, do background checks, things of that nature. And the reason for that is to give officers who are on the streets quick access to information of people that might be important to officers on how they deal with people. So he was requesting that particular unit, and when I say run James Boyd, he's basically that's the way we say, could you please check the name James Boyd with this date of birth and see if anything comes up as far as criminal history, any kind of mental illness contacts, any CIT contacts with the actual CIT detectives, and any past police reports that may, tell a little bit more about James Boyd than what they know from on the side of the mountain.
So at 6:04, the process began by which the Real-Time Crime Center began to access all of the Albuquerque Police Department databases to find out what was known by the Albuquerque Police Department about James Boyd.
That's correct.
Now, before they learned about what the Albuquerque Police Department as an organization knew about James Boyd, a number of important events that I want to cover. And first, I would like to go to 617. I'm sorry, 617. Now, who made this comment and what does this comment mean?
So 729 is the call sign for SWAT Officer Jeffrey McFarland. He was one of the very first SWAT officers to actually show up on scene. So what he's saying is he wants a perimeter around the base of the hill. Going back to what I talked about, kind of a 360 around James Boyd's camp. And then he's advising to have a tactical withdrawal of all officers. So he's telling all the officers, Officer Monet, Sergeant Carpenter, Brock Niprath, Wetterlin, and Virgilio, to actually start creating more distance from James Boyd and start setting up a perimeter. And then also we'll be sending officers to block north and south pedestrian traffic along that western north-south running trail.
Now, you would agree with me that Sergeant Carpenter, because of his rank, had authority or supervisory control over a subordinate officer such as Officer McFarland.
That is correct.
Right. So when Carpenter, based on your experience and work in the Albuquerque Police Department, always had the veto power, that is, to countermand Officer McFarland to move down the hill.
He could have.
Yeah. Now, based on your investigation in this case, did anyone, including Sergeant Carpenter, voice an objection to the request made by Officer McFarland for the field services officers to move away from James Boyd?
None that I could find, no.
So, to the extent that you conducted a very thorough investigation, it's fair to say that when Officer McFarland requested the field services officers to leave the area around Mr. Boyd, There were no objections voiced by anyone.
No.
I apologize because of I missed it, and I'd like to turn your attention to 6:17. That was just a few minutes before the request was made to have the field officers moved off the hill. I'm showing you another comment that was made, and I'd like to ask you who made that comment, and what does that comment mean?
Sure. This comment was actually at 6:13. It was made by, again, Sergeant Carpenter, and he's advising dispatch of what James Boyd is saying. Saying subject made statements, he would not put down his weapons, stated that if 34's officers went any closer that somebody would get hurt, and that he was too military trained to be the one to get hurt.
Based on your investigation, what difference, if any, was Officer Monet able to have with regards to the negotiations he attempted with Mr. Boyd?
Mr. Monet, or Officer Monet, at times did get Mr. Boyd very calmed down, and they actually had a very good rapport and dialogue, and he would let Mr. Boyd just kind of talk on and on and on. However, when it came to the issue of telling James Boyd that he needed to put his knives down away from his body, like on the ground, those conversations never went anywhere.
So you would agree with me that under the Albuquerque Police Department handling of the mentally ill, that the first order of business for a CIT officer is to ensure the safety of the suspect or the subject and officers at the scene?
That's correct.
And that negotiations can only go so far if there still is a threat to officers on the scene?
That's correct.
And the first duty of a CIT officer is trying to achieve officer safety?
That's correct.
And without achieving officer safety, a CIT officer can't move forward, is that right?
As far as bringing about a peaceful resolution, that's true if the person that they're talking to is still armed.
So it was, I forgot to ask these questions at the time that it occurred, but who was the state police officer who spoke with Mr. Boyd?
It was State Police Officer Mitch Bankston.
And you had an opportunity to review Officer Mitch Bankston's belt tape of this incident.
Yes.
So you know what was said on Officer Bankston's belt tape?
Yes.
And you would also agree that Officer Scott Weimerskirch had his video running that recorded that incident as well?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you would agree with me that Officer Mitch Bankston, despite the fact that Officer Bankston was requested to be there by Mr. Boyd, was also unable to have Mr. Boyd relinquish possession of his knives?
Yes, so Officer Bankston actually spoke with Mr. Boyd on two separate occasions. The first occasion, the big thing that Officer Bankston was able to get out of James Boyd was his name and date of birth. Prior to that, he was only referring to himself as Da Boss, or Ba, B-A. So, but as far as getting him to surrender, no.
So what Officer Mitch Bankston was able to do that was helpful in the encounter with Mr. Boyd was to convince Mr. Boyd to give the officers his date of birth. And that's what the information that was necessary for the Real-Time Crime Center to run their searches.
Yes.
Now, turning your attention to the need to create a perimeter. Based on your investigation, is it fair to say that there were a number of citizens, that is, people who were visiting the open space, who needed to be kept out of this location?
Yes. Again, going back to the reasons you form a perimeter is so you don't have citizens who just simply don't know what's going on wander into the situation where they could get hurt or get killed.
Based on your investigation, how many citizens were enjoying the open space when this incident was taking place?
I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it was several. There was actually one point where a lady is running on the trail just below where all the negotiations are going on.
So it's fair to say that during the course of your investigations, you found that there were a number of incidents where folks were just simply enjoying the open space, sort of oblivious to what was happening just above them.
Some of them were oblivious, and then there were some who were further above View Mound that were actually kind of doing their daily activities, whatever they were doing up there, and then started becoming spectators to what was going on below them.
What is the danger of having spectators to a police incident such as this?
Depending on where the people are standing and being spectators at, if they are in what we would consider a kill zone, and by what I mean a kill zone is if I have a gun oriented this way because the threat is this way, anything that is kind of behind the threat or in front of me is a kill zone, because if I have to fire my weapon that way and say a bullet goes that way, if there's a spectator on the other side who doesn't know what's going on, there's a fear that they may be struck with the bullet or just kind of get in the way of the process. So that is why we, again, form these what we call kill zones and perimeters to keep spectators out, or at least to an area where they can watch from relative safety.
Okay. So it's not an effort to try and prevent folks from seeing what's happening. It's an effort to try and ensure their safety. Is that a fair assessment?
That's correct.
So a perimeter is not just simply to contain someone who's inside the perimeter, but also to keep people on the outside from either intentionally or accidentally entering the perimeter.
That's correct.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention to 556. What information do we learn from this particular CAD entry?
We learned that call sign 842, which I believe is Detective Keith Sandy, arrives on scene.
So it's correct to say that Officer Sandy was had arrived at the incident at 5:56 p.m.?
That's correct.
Turning your attention to 616. What do we learn from this entry?
We learned that one of the canine officers, 754, who I believe off the top of my head is Kenneth Ronzone. I might have to refer to the CAD to refresh.
I believe the CAD is there. It should be there. Exhibit A.
Okay, I'm sorry, 754 is the call sign for Scott Weimer-Skirch.
And Officer Weimer-Skirch is the canine officer who's involved in the final phase of this incident with Mr. Boyd. Is that right?
That's correct.
So he shows up at approximately 6:16.
That's correct.
Now, I want to turn your attention to what happens at 6:23. Would you walk us through who made this statement and what this statement over the radio was?
So it's 6:23. It's a comment coming from RC35, and RC35 is going to be the real-time crime center officer that has logged on to this call from his station. And the real-time crime center is located at the main police station here downtown. And he is the one that took the request to do the background of James Boyd and see what he could find. So once he compiled all the information that he thought that the officers needed right away, he not only will put that out over the radio, but it will be added to the CAD, which is what you're seeing here. So it's saying that the subject, James Boyd, listed in CIT but has no cases.
Let me stop you there because there's a lot of information here, and I want to just go through it in sort of in order. James Boyd listed in CIT, no case. What does that mean?
It means that he was not actively being contacted by detectives with CIT. And what that means is there are certain individuals throughout the city that that may require more attention from the crisis intervention trained detectives on kind of maybe a weekly or monthly basis because of maybe past run-ins with law enforcement officers or past things that they have done to just citizens. And in order to keep track of them and make sure that they're safe and everyone else is safe, they'll have open cases.
So the officers were told over the radio, and I want to make sure you confirm this, what was actually said over the radio, that James Boyd did not have an active CIT case. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, there's the next statement that's made after no CIT case. What is that?
It says James Boyd has an extensive criminal history of aggravated battery on peace officers in various jurisdictions, including Albuquerque.
So when a law enforcement officer learns that the suspect has a criminal history of aggravated battery on peace officers, what does that tell an officer in terms of officer safety?
It tells them a couple things, actually, because taking people into custody, putting them in handcuffs and taking them to jail is a part of our job. On any kind of given day, the majority of people, when you're telling them that they're going to jail and they're going to be handcuffed, are cooperative. And you can approach them normally and place them in handcuffs. However, if you have knowledge that a person has committed assaults on peace officers in the past, then you won't necessarily, or you may not necessarily approach them the same way that you would approach someone who doesn't have a past of that.
Now, you said assault, and what I read here is aggravated battery.
Correct.
What's the difference between an assault and an actual battery?
So an assault is the threat of harm, so the threat of actually hurting somebody. And the battery is when that's actually committed, so which means aggravated battery. What they're saying is that there is a criminal history past of James Boyd actually physically attacking police officers.
So when it says aggravated battery, what does that mean?
Either it was done with a deadly weapon or
proceed.
Based on your training and experience, how would a police officer interpret the term aggravated battery on a peace officer?
He would interpret it from what the state statute constitute as an aggravated battery
And
on a peace officer.
Okay, what is an aggravated battery? Based on your training and experience, what is an aggravated battery? How would a peace officer determine what that is?
Aggravated battery on a peace officer consists of someone who batters a peace officer with either a deadly weapon or causes great bodily harm.
Is this a good place to break for
Yes.
lunch? Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take our lunch recess now. I'll ask that you report to the first floor jury assembly room at 1:15. Thank you. Please stand for the jury.